So this meeting is going to be recorded. I will make it available out on our DUAB webpage after the fact. It actually goes up through a YouTube channel that we have for DUAB. Then I also wanted to just walk through some basic aspects of this WebEx meeting, especially for anyone who may not have participated in a WebEx event like this in the past. There are 3 different ways that folks have to connect. Fortunately, if you're already here, that's good. You've figured out how to connect. But we do have WebEx through the web browser. There's a WebEx app. And then folks can also call in just through a general telephone connection. If you do the telephone connection, the one unfortunate aspect of that is that it's not possible for you to tell me that you want to give public comment. And so in that regard, if you do have public comment and you're on the telephone as an attendee, well, I'll actually give you some other options after the fact for how to get your comments to us. If you are having any difficulties, I do have instructions up on the DUAB webpage of how to kind of navigate through this WebEx situation, as well as how to send chats and raising your hand, which we'll talk about when we get to the public comment portion as well. If you do experience any issues, please feel free to send me a chat. You send a message that will come straight to me, so I will get to it as soon as I can. But that at least will let me know if you're encountering any issues. A couple other just notes for attendees. All attendees, you are automatically on mute. When we get to the public comment section, I will unmute you as it's your turn to speak. And then the other thing just to be aware of is that you as an attendee, you are not able to see the list of other attendees. So on your screen, it's going to look like you're the only person here. In terms of attendees, that is not true. We do have many folks who have logged into this committee meeting, but just want to make sure you understand that that's just the way this WebEx event kind of is being set up. So as I said, this meeting is being recorded and will be made available on our webpage later. All right, so with that, again, call the meeting to order. I will also recognize compliance with open door law. The notice was posted up through the DUAB webpage, as well as we have a presence of a quorum with our committee members. We actually have all of our committee members here, so thank you all for joining us. This is just the general agenda of what we're going to do for this meeting. First, we'll walk through, and I'll have each committee member just kind of introduce themselves. Then I will share some comments on kind of what has transpired with the fiscal indicators since the last time we did meet back in 2018. Then we'll have a committee discussion on the existing indicators as well as any potential indicators. And then after that, we'll open it up to public comment. And again, when we get to the public comment part, I'll kind of walk the attendees through how to let me know that you want to comment. So with that, first things first, we'll jump in on introductions. If we can just go kind of in order as we see here on the slide, just go ahead and unmute yourself, let us know who you are, where you're from, and any other information you want to share.
Ambre, Department of Education, Director of the Office of School Finance, and I've been with the department going on 12 years.
Senior Budget Analyst at State Budget Agency. I specialize in K through 12 education over here.
Brown, Director of Engagement and Analytics at the Management Performance Hub.
I am the Financial Analyst for the Department of Local Government Finance.
I am Rob James. I am the IASBO representative for the committee. I am replacing Dave Holt, who was on the committee before. I am the Director of Business at the Lake Central School Corporation, and I've been here in school business. I've been here at Lake Central for 10 years, and I'm part of school business for 13 years. So thank you.
I'm with the State Board of Accounts. I've been with the department for about 7 years. one of the directors in the office that oversees schools and townships, and my main duties are providing trainings and helping local officials for schools and townships.
And I am Courtney Scoffsma. I serve as the Executive Director for the Distressed Unit Appeal Board, and then as part of that, also then DUAB's appointee to this board. I've been here at DUAB for 3 years now, and prior to that, spent 7 years over at the Department of Local Government Finance. So, all right. Well, first and foremost, welcome and thank you to everybody, all the committee members. I'm glad you are here, especially any new folks who are joining us. Welcome aboard. We look forward to working with you. All right. So next, I just wanted to provide kind of a short update on what has transpired over the last couple of years in terms of the school fiscal indicators. So for the indicators themselves, this committee last met really June of 2018 through October of 2018, and we, through that process, prepared the 8 existing fiscal indicators that we currently have, took those to State Budget Committee in October of 2018, got their kind of approval of those indicators as well, and then the first release of the indicators was at the end of 2018, December 31st, 2018. With that first release, that was kind of the first time we had all the full visualization that MPH helps us with, and really had very good response. I clearly remember in that very first week that we released them, even though that's kind of holiday and break time, had great interest in the indicators as soon as they were released, had a lot of views on the site, so was very encouraged by just the general engagement with indicators. From there, then in 2019, what kind of my other side of my role at DUAB, DUAB is tasked then with taking the indicators for each school corporation and evaluating those indicators and ultimately determining, are there school corporations that we should go and meet with and conduct an assessment is what it is called. Now, the assessment process itself is confidential, so I can't provide a lot of details in terms of who we've visited or how many or anything like that. But I do think that it's important for this committee to have a little bit of feedback in terms of how that process has gone. So in terms of the assessments, like I say here, in 2019, we did do a review of the indicators and did conduct an assessment process. We also here in 2020 actually have been doing the review of the indicators, and we currently are working on kind of finalizing that list of which school corporations may be involved in the assessment process this year. We are working hard to be cognizant of the challenges that are facing school corporations at this point in time, given the current COVID situation. So we want to be sensitive to imposing too many other requirements on top of what folks are already dealing with. But especially looking back at 2019 and that assessment process, for me personally, I would say that it was a great process. It was very insightful. The school corporations that we visited, I really have to give them a lot of credit. They were very open and transparent, and I felt like I walked away from those assessments with a great deal of information. So really do appreciate all of the school corporations who have participated and just have been willing to work with us on this process. In terms of kind of how we have the interaction of the indicators and the assessment process, for 2019, I would say DUAB was on the more conservative side in terms of how the board analyzed the indicators and identified which school corporations we would go and meet with. Being the first year of the assessment process, I think the default was to go and talk to a school corporation rather than not engaging with a school corporation and potentially running into a situation where there was a problem down the road. So again, I think we probably erred on the side of being conservative in our review of the indicators. I do expect that as we do this assessment process more and more, and as we fine-tune this process, we'll probably be able to better lock in what that right place is to go and talk to school corporations. Overall, I think the indicators that we had identified previously, I do feel like they were good indicators for identifying kind of that 30,000-foot level of fiscal health for school corporations. I think that they were overall pretty helpful in helping us know who to go speak with. Oftentimes what we encountered, or what I encountered when I would go in to do an assessment, is I'd walk in and the school corporation was able to fill me in on what their plans were. I didn't really encounter situations where I walked into school corporations and they were surprised. I think everybody seems to be doing a great job of monitoring their fiscal health and making sure that they're making those necessary plans and adjustments along the way. So again, I was excited by that to really get to engage with those school corps and see what their plans were. I would say, and again, kind of thinking through this idea that DUAB was more conservative in the way that they identified and probably over-identified some school corporations, I would say that we did have a few what I would call false positives, where we did go and talk to some school corporations, and perhaps really at the end of the day, there wasn't as much there that we needed to be concerned with as the indicators initially may have indicated. I think the two primary reasons for that were not so much the indicators themselves, as they were either one, the kind of the time lag that is built into the indicators. So for example, we are currently, the work that we're doing now will help to form the indicators that will be released here at the end of 2020, which will include up through calendar year 2019 data. So I think that's a piece of it. It's just that we do have a time lag included with our indicators. And then I'd say the other situation that we encountered was a situation where it was something just really specific to a school corporation. Perhaps they had a special reserve fund that wouldn't be picked up necessarily in our normal analysis. And so really without speaking with the school corporation directly, I wouldn't have necessarily known to look for that and to know that, that's how that money can be utilized. So again, I think we had just a few of those kind of false positives, but not so many that I felt like the indicators were not working the way that they were supposed to. We will, in just a minute here, we will actually start to talk about the indicators themselves, but just to kind of give some additional background. In terms of the additional or the existing indicators, I'd say the ones that primarily formed that foundational analysis for all school corporations really were ADM, fund balance as percent of expenditures, and then kind of both the fund balances / annual deficit and surplus indicators that we currently have. So that's kind of 4 of the 8 that we have. The other 4 indicators, I think once we had kind of that foundational analysis done with those, the big 4 indicators, the other 4 indicators helped to kind of provide some additional detail about a particular school corporation situation. And if we saw things happening within the big 4 indicators, were there other things within those the other 4 indicators that might help to explain what we were seeing? So ultimately, we did use all of the indicators along the way, but certainly probably had more of a reliance on the ADM, the fund balance type of indicators than some of the other indicators that are currently out there. So with that, that's just kind of the general summary I wanted to provide of where we stand. Like it shows here, we did go ahead, we did a second release of the indicators at the end of 19. And then, as I said, we're currently working through the list for 2020 and working to identify who may need to have a visit. But before we jump into kind of the next part, I'm happy to committee has any questions or additional information that you were looking for, I'm happy to take any questions. All right, good. All right, well, from there then, the next thing I'd like to do is to move into kind of a committee discussion of our existing indicators. And then also kind of along those lines, as we have that conversation, if there are other things that come up, other ideas that come up as potential indicators, certainly want to talk through those as well. So as we walk through, over the next few slides, I have captured just a screenshot of each of the different indicators, and we can kind of flip through those. But these were just some of the questions I had out there in terms of how we can think through the current indicators. So first and foremost, on the dashboard overall, while we had seen some mock-ups of what the dashboard could look like the last time that this committee met, certainly by the time it actually got visualized through MPH, it looks a little bit different. And also just kind of want feedback from folks in terms of, you know, does it work well, or do you have any recommendations in terms of how that dashboard process might be updated? And then on the existing indicators, I think some of the main questions I have, but if there are other ones, feel free to share. You know, one, is this still, do we still feel like this is an important indicator? And then secondly, what is the best way to account for the new accounting structure in this indicator, or are there any changes that need to be made? And so by that, I mean really the change that happened starting in 2019 with the new education and operations funds. I do feel, in talking to school corporations, I feel like that has changed the way that we probably need to track some of these things. But certainly want to get the committee's thoughts on that and how they're seeing kind of that change in the accounting structure impacting the way these indicators are presented. So before we jump in on specific indicators, I guess just from a committee standpoint, are there general thoughts on the indicators or the dashboards in general that we can talk through?
I'll jump in. I'll say that, you know, I'm one of the committee members who's actually here in the field using this. I presented the indicators to my school board in a public meeting. I felt the dashboard was very easy to maneuver through and get the information and download. It was presented in a format that average citizens and school boards were able to, you know, follow along. It wasn't too complicated. So I know other people and my peers that I've talked to in my meetings generally felt the same way, that the dashboard in general and the 8 indicators were good indicators that generally apply to almost every school district. I know there's talking about operating referendums was one of them, and that doesn't apply to all, but for the ones that it does apply to, it was a good marker and indicator. So just on a general scope, from one who's actually using it out in the field, I thought it was well done by the committee and easy to use.
Great, thank you very much, and props to MPH for all of the work they did and really visualizing it and making it user-friendly. That's really on them. I just do the behind-the-scenes data.
I would say I also have used the indicators on a few occasions just to look and see if I could figure out what was going on with a particular school as we were looking at Form 9 data. And I agree with Rob's comments. I felt like it was easy to follow. I thought the graphs were like, you know, you look at them, the information's there, it's clear, easy to understand. And then if you did want to dig deeper, it was easy enough to do that as well. So I didn't, I didn't see anything about the indicators that I thought, oh, this isn't, worth much or anything like that. I thought it was very user-friendly and helpful information.
Great. Thank you.
I agree with Melissa and Rob that it looks very good and it's easy to use. One suggestion that I'd like to make is that we talked about putting the data from the audit reports in the dashboard, and it was kind of hard because we don't collect that data outside of the PDF file that our report is in. So I think 2 years ago in our last meeting, we decided just to link to our audit report database at the bottom. It would be great, I think, if we could have where you select a school and then at the top underneath the address, it links directly to their audit report. So they don't have to be directed to our website and then search. Because I'd be very surprised if one of the schools that you visit, Courtney, they don't already have a going concern comment in the audit report. Okay.
Yeah, that is a good idea and something I can certainly work with MPH on. I suppose if I can provide the direct link, see if we can get that populated right there up at the top. That makes a lot of sense. Okay. Well, let's go ahead and let's jump in then on the indicators themselves, the current indicators. And again, if this conversation spurs additional thoughts, feel free to jump in. Really on all of this, just general kind of free-flowing conversation for the committee as we go through this. So jump in as you feel the need. So first and foremost, we have the ADM indicator. This one has been pretty standard. I think kind of a question that I have as it pertains to this particular indicator is with the new February count, if that's something we think we should start to filter into this as well, just kind of starting with those years where it became a determination in terms of the overall tuition support. But happy for any other thoughts or ideas or comments on this one.
Melissa, do you think it'd be useful to put, like, if they're virtual or virtual due to COVID? Yeah.
Well, I think now that beginning in fiscal year 20, we're tracking virtual versus traditional students, it might be worth noting that, not as much as the virtual due to COVID, because hopefully after the current school year, that doesn't come into play as much, and that really each student. But because both the September and February count were used for funding last year and they are again this year, they do play into how the revenue comes in for a school district. And typically the February ADMs are lower than the fall ADMs, and probably, and I'm just throwing an odd number out there, maybe like 7,000 students from fall to spring decrease. It might be worth showing those in the years in which the February ADM is used for funding. I mean, the other option is you could use like an average ADM if you just wanted to reflect one data point for each year. So it just depends on, what the group is interested in doing. But I do think you, Chase, in response, yeah, I think we need to pay attention to virtual because that does generate less funding now for public schools. So.
It makes a lot of sense for us to show that. And certainly I think with the February count, I feel like we should be able to just kind of for any given year kind of drop in a secondary column kind of right next to it to show what that February count would be. Obviously, we'll have to work with the developers to make sure that we could do that. One other kind of question I have here is, so realistically, given the time frame of when I've been releasing the indicators, we typically do actually have one additional year of data. So for example, this particular screenshot is from last year's, so released at the end of 2019. By that time, we would have had the September 2019 data, which really we would tie to 2020. I didn't include it here just from the standpoint of trying to, what the best way is, trying to keep the ADM as closely tied to the indicators, the rest of the indicators, because we kind of have the financial data is on more of a lag. But I guess a question for the committee would be, if that ADM data is available, more recent data is available, does it make sense to go ahead and populate it here, even if it doesn't necessarily tie to the rest of the financial data?
This is Melissa. I guess I would say, I mean, I could go either way, because we do a tuition support report and we try to only reflect the ADM that's associated with that report and the data in it. Otherwise, people are like, okay, well, how did this feed in, and they get somewhat confused. But then the other side is, I like, if data is available, for it to be out there. So it would have to have some kind of a disclaimer if you do put the additional ADM information on there, that it's not reflective in the funding streams that you're seeing. The other good thing with having the most up-to-date ADM out there is, if the fiscal indicators from 19 were showing something was going on, you could see if there was probably continued issues into 20, or maybe ADM improved, which means funding improved, or maybe you could see sooner if a school went from traditional to virtual, had virtual programs. So there's some positive things that you can see by having that ADM in there. But if you do that, you just have to make sure people understand that you haven't seen the funding come in from that ADM.
Sure.
So.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, we are actually also getting some comments and questions, so I'm going to go ahead and put these out to the group as well. So first, just one is, yes, this recording will be posted up to the DoAB webpage later. Then we have a question about, with the ADM, so the ADM and the way kindergartners were counted changed from 2015, 2016. And I think the way that it's included in here may have resulted in the indicator itself looking misleading, where perhaps the kindergartners were included, because I think they used to be half, if they were in at 0.5, and then they switched to full. And so I don't know, for the years where they were counted as 0.5, I think I kept them counted as 0.5. So then in that 1 year from 15 to 16, you see kind of that jump when they go from 0.5 up to 1. And I think that could just cause a situation where school corporations ADM looks maybe steady when really it wasn't. So I wanted to see if folks had a thought in terms of a better way to do that, or if there's a different way that should be handled.
I don't see the need to change it, because that's reflective of what the total ADM count was for that school. But we could note that, from 15 to 16, full day kindergarten was separately, a separate grant, and then it was rolled into the basic grant, where students were counted as a half, if they were half day kids, or one as full day kids, and kind of explain that difference. The other thing is, we're getting so far away from that year that occurred, that I feel like the focus is probably more on the last 3 years than the last 5 or 6, as to when the indicators roll out. And it's been consistent that they're 1 if they're in a full day kindergarten program since that time.
Okay. Okay. All right. Okay, let's see. A couple other questions coming in. So question would be on the ADMs. We had talked about kind of the virtual or in-person. Would there be interest also in kind of a home enrollment versus open enrollment type of distinction on the ADM? I think that definitely, I would say, as I have spoken with some school corporations, I do feel like that plays into their story. In some cases, it has played into their story. Is that something that would be worthwhile to kind of show that level of detail?
So Courtney, is the question like it's a resident attender versus they have a student that's outside their district coming in, and to distinguish between who their students are?
Yeah, I believe so. Mm-hmm.
We have that data. It's just, I guess I'd want to better understand how a school explained it. If they were getting the funding for the student, I mean, what is the picture they think that it would show, that they're just getting, they have more resident attendees within their district than they do from outside their district, so they're not reliant on other kids coming from out of district? Or can you explain kind of the context of the question?
Yeah, I mean, I think for the question itself is just this of, you know, in-district students versus open enrollment students. Mm-hmm. But I would say, you know, a situation where I've seen this particular issue play out would be a school corporation that maybe has a larger reliance on open enrollment students. And then ultimately, does that impact their ability down the road if they were to look to do a referendum or something like that? Would that kind of tie their hands a little bit more in terms of what they could do? So, and again, on these, you know, today is just conversation. We don't need to finalize anything. So, so don't feel pressured to say, yes, let's come to any type of agreement. Even if it's just a matter of you want to think about that further before we come back next week, that is fine.
I guess I would just jump in and say, you know, that's information that it doesn't hurt. I don't know if I'd put it on just like on this main screen here. Maybe it's something that you would be able to hover over to get the breakdown instead of just trying to fit it all into the one page. Mm-hmm. I guess it would be, this is more of a question for Courtney though. If you had that breakdown, and you kind of alluded to it, how is that useful in determining if a district is having some issues? Because one might say, hey, if my enrollment is steady, it doesn't really matter if they're residents or non-residents. We've had this policy, we're open, our doors are open. Because we're relying on these kids, we're never going to close them unless forced to legislatively. So it may not even really be an issue. Mm-hmm. So I would resort to, I think it's good information, but if DUAB isn't going to have a need for that breakdown, then maybe we don't need to put it in there. Because, I mean, I'm looking at these 8 indicators of these are the groundwork and the stepping stones to get in front of things down the road. And if it's up to DUAB if that would be an indicator that they can utilize that breakdown.
Sure. So one thing I would say is, I always have to be careful on how much I say, but I will say the public transfer report from DOE is a report that I do rely on heavily as I look at the indicators and as I prep for assessments. That is some information that I do review. Now, I think the thing with it would be, while knowing how many students they're gaining is important, I think from a fiscal health perspective, what's equally important, if not more important, is how many students they're losing. And I don't know how we would capture that on this type of indicator, kind of in this graphical type of format. But that data is definitely something that I do look at and consider as we look through the school corporations and try to sort out where they stand from a fiscal health perspective. Let's see. Another kind of question or comment that had come in was somewhat similar, saying the ADM, another component of the ADM is transfer in students for the Career Center. And so I think in that case, that's a situation where those students are not necessarily counted here in the ADM, but they do help to generate additional funding for the school corporation by bringing those students in and getting that CTE funding. So again, that was just kind of another component of enrollment to consider as to, is this something we need to think about and try to capture in some way? All right, I'm going to go ahead and jump to the next one. So next one here is just fund balances. This one really doesn't have a lot of analysis behind it. It's pretty much just here's kind of the summary of the different fund balances, and then as you have the ability to kind of behind the scenes, you can click in. You can click into it and kind of get that larger picture in terms of the individual fund balances. This one would be a situation where obviously we have the change in the accounting structure. So a couple of ways that I could see to do this. One would be to make some sort of attempt to crosswalk the prior year's data into more of the current accounting structure. Or kind of the other option, which would be probably easier and more reliant on just the actual data that's been submitted, would be basically for the 2019 calendar year data, you just start to add in these new funds. So where up at the top you have the indicator or the little check boxes, right now it says general fund, maybe that flips to general/education funds. Operational funds, before that was capital projects, transportation and bus, that could now be the operations fund starting in 2019. So just kind of a question out there as to, do we need to try to do some type of crosswalk, or do we think it's okay to have that, basically kind of that switch in the data from 2018 to 2019?
We've made a crosswalk that we placed on our website that may be of assistance to you if you want to do the crosswalk thing. I'd agree that you definitely need to rename those check boxes. And have you thought about maybe a separate graph where this is with the old accounting structure and this is with the new accounting structure? One.
Yeah, I haven't thought about it, but certainly open to any ideas or suggestions.
I guess it would be, from my standpoint, I'm thinking this is more of a technical issue, and how, I'm going to say easily, could those prior 6-7 years be converted to the new data? Or is it just worth putting a note somewhere on the page and explaining in a few sentences how the law and the accounting changed effective January going forward of January 19? I know it's only 1 year, but eventually at some point, 8, 9, 10 years down the road from here, it's going to fall off.
Right.
But that's a ways to go. I would just, I don't know logistically how easily it would be to pull the prior Form 9 data from 2012, 13, 14, 15, crosswalk it with those account codes, and then kind of, in essence, still have an explanation, but then they would be consistent. I can't really make an opinion on that because I don't know how difficult it would be.
Right. Yeah, I would say one thing just from my standpoint, and this is just maybe a personal belief, as much as possible on these indicators, I have always tried to keep the data tied to the original source document. Where I have been concerned is a situation where somebody would come to the indicators and look at the indicator data, but then they'd go out to like the school financial reports on DOE, and suddenly we've got different numbers there. That has always concerned me to the point where, just as an example, there's a situation that we've encountered where I know that the school corporation was using a fund that probably wasn't the exact right fund to use, and so it popped up weird on their indicators. But again, I've been hesitant to go in and change that on the indicators because if you go to their Form 9, that is the fund that they used on the Form 9. So even though it flags oddly on the indicators, I haven't wanted to change that. So I think from the standpoint of trying to do a crosswalk, maybe that would be where my concern would be, is then do we create new data that doesn't really have a good primary source to tie back to? Or is there an option where if we were to keep the existing data for the kind of those prior years, is there an option to have that link to the crosswalk for those who would be interested in doing that? Maybe there's local school corporations that want to do it, and I have seen that in some school corporations as we've talked. They've kind of gone back and recreated a few years, recreated it into the new accounting structure. But maybe it's just more giving them the tools to do that if they would like to do that.
Well, on a philosophical aspect, I guess I would just say that whether or not you call it general fund or education fund, under the new system, there may be more or less activity running through that fund. Same thing with the operations fund. But at the bottom line, the fund balance is the fund balance. And you should always try to maintain a healthy fund balance, whatever the amount of activity is running through there. So does it matter if and I'm just talking out loud here for this fund balance indicator, if it doesn't matter if I had $40 million running through my general/education fund or $60 million running through there, I still need to have a healthy fund balance overall. And I think that is still almost automatically consistent when you pull the Form 9s. Mm-hmm. And so maybe we don't, for this particular one, maybe we don't need to necessarily convert that data so much, because to be fiscally responsible on this slide, you're really just looking at what that last 12/31 or June 30th amount is.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Yeah, and whether it's, a whole separate graph, or maybe even if it's all included in one graph, the thought I had is maybe there's a way for us to do a really good line or some type of extra column there between 2018 and 2019 to kind of more clearly show, hey, we've got a shift here. And if you're going to be looking at this data, it's not fully apples to apples, but kind of to your point, fund balance ultimately is fund balance. So, all right. Jump to the next one, and this may be kind of similar. This is really just kind of another way to look at that fund balance and what has transpired within those fund balances. So this is the annual deficit and surplus calculation. It does also include fund balance, is kind of these little, the little lines that you see here. It has the same selection options as the prior one did. So it feels as though if we update the selection options on fund balance, probably also do similar updates here. But didn't know if there are other thoughts on this particular one in terms of any other changes that might be needed for it.
Again, I jumped in as being someone who had to present this data to their public and to their school board, and I guess this kind of goes back to both slides. You know, from talking with Dave Holt and Melissa and watching the prior meetings, I know it's always been alluded to that, you know, the data is just the data and it doesn't really tell the story. And until you really dive into it, there could be some things that jump out that just on the graph that looks like a red flag, but until you have someone to explain it to you, you don't get the whole story. And when I was preparing this to present to my board, I decided that I wanted to select every single fund there on the top right that was possible, because I had the opinion that if I didn't check a particular fund or group of funds, then it's going to look as if I'm not presenting that for a particular reason. And I didn't want to be questioned like, oh, hey, why are you not hiding, or why are you not showing that one? Why are you hiding that one? I was like, no, I want to be all open and show you everything. We've got nothing to hide. We want it to be a true reflection of the report. But unfortunately, when you do that, you pulling in a lot of funds, particularly under the all local funds or all funds, that really skew the data. And, you know, for example, for the fund balances, we have so many grants that work on a reimbursement basis now, not only your federal programs, but common school loans. And so next thing you know, you have bars that are in the negative, and really, until you explain it in a public meeting, most people aren't going to understand that. And I feel the same way for the annual deficit surplus. There is a timing issue. Like, for example, in my particular school district, we did a lot of construction that we sold GEO bonds for. So we put that money in a construction fund. So that revenue for that one particular year was high, but then it took 2 or 3 years to spend all the dollars. And when the 1 year, my annual I have an annual surplus, and then my next 2 or 3 years, it's in the negative, and it looks like we're overspending or not doing things well. And I didn't have an option really to not select those funds. It was either all or nothing. You know, some of us still have pension bond money that we're paying out, not in the debt service side, but for bonds that were sold. Well, that money came in 15 years ago and is just being spent down over time. You know, so it's what us in the field as business managers know. We know that story, and that's what we're presenting to our board and our public. So that was my only, I know I'm kind of going off scale here a little bit, but when I was presenting these things, these were the things that, for me talking with my peers, were things that we noted of, you know, you really got to tell the story with each of the charts, because it's great information, but unless people can have the explanation told to them, they're not going to get it. So I don't know what I'm suggesting. Maybe when it comes to funds to select, maybe we need to work with that a little bit so that it doesn't skew the data as much. And again, I just didn't want the perception of I'm excluding funds and people wonder why I was excluding funds.
Right.
So.
Yep. Well,
fortunately, I was able to explain those things, but unless you happen to be in our boardroom at that time, you didn't hear any of that.
Right.
So.
Yeah, you are not alone in that sentiment. Actually, as you were speaking just before you got to the part about the bonds, we also had a comment come in that said the same thing of when you get those bond proceeds, it really does start to skew the data in that particular year. So I think that's definitely something we need to think through. And you're right, maybe it is just something up in the way that the funds are grouped. I'll need to think through a little bit more in terms of your comment. I think it's a good comment about, you know, I feeling like you had to present everything so that people don't feel like you're hiding something. I'm not sure if there's an easier way to do that or have a better distinction.
Rob was speaking, I was thinking, what if you had like a all federal funds tab that just encompasses the federal funds, because there's a breakout between state, local, and federal funds. So I wonder about like other local funds, other state funds, other federal funds that are those beside the main education and operations and general fund that we would be showing in rainy day. That kind of, I don't know, Rob, if that would help if they were like grouped by fund type, which is how they're actually grouped on our ESSA report. So it would kind of give some continuity to schools on how the data is being displayed. I don't know. It was just, when you were talking, that just sounded like a good
it
thought.
kind of goes back to what Courtney mentioned before of having once the data shown here to match what's on other state reports and Form 9s that the public has access to. So I think that's definitely something that we could look at, that the group of other local funds is where it can get a little bit tricky, because you're going to tie in school lunch and textbook rental and these construction and pension funds that I mentioned that aren't on that federal and state side. But I think it's something that the group can definitely could talk about.
Yeah. Another idea here would be kind of thinking through the way that we present fund balance, kind of grouped more by these fund types. And I agree, maybe the fund types need to be modified to better align with other reporting. But then when we come here to annual deficit and surplus, what if instead of showing receipts and expenditures, what if it was more by fund type? You've got just deficit or surplus, and then you could hover over it to get that revenue and expenditure number. But then you'd kind of have that breakout. I think it'd be difficult maybe to get that full picture of what happened overall. But that just may be another way to visualize it, so that as you're presenting it, it's a little bit easier to say, well, these funds are here, but then here's our federal funds. These are a lot of reimbursables, so you see the negative here. Maybe that makes it a touch easier. Just an idea. Also have an idea here of see some value in combining the operations and education funds in a chart. And that especially, I think, actually is a pretty good segue into the next indicator, because I think that's where I've seen the most impact of the new accounting structure and trying to sort out how do we look at this. So this next one is the fund balances as percent of expenditures. And so for this, we did have a more limited selection option. We had just the general fund, operational funds, and rainy day. As you'll see here on this, I would say largely, you know, when I would look at this, one of the first cuts I would look at would be general and rainy day. And I think that's something we talked a lot about in these prior meetings, was really under the old structure, general and rainy day were your most flexible funds. So trying to make sure that you had that money, and then kind of had talked about, generally had talked about kind of having that 1 month threshold. Now, as I've been out doing assessments, this is still, I give this example all the time because I still think it's just great, but one of the school corporations had talked about how now with the education and operations, it's like you have two separate buckets, but they've got that pipe in between them, just given the way that you can kind of flow the funds back and forth. So especially on this one, I struggle with, would you ever just look at operations, or really do we need to always be looking at this more from an education and operations together? Because in many respects, they each kind of control the other's fate.
I need to look at them all together. You, up until 2019, you know, they each had their own silos, buckets, whatever you want to call them. And it was pretty distinguished and they stood on their own. But now when you have 10, 15% of money flowing between the two, you know, in many cases more than that, if you really want a true picture of what's going on at a district, you have to put all, well, education and ops together, and I would say rainy day, because it just doesn't tell the story looking at one or the other. I will say that I've recently gone through a few S&P bond ratings, and, you know, they're almost doing an outside view of what we're trying to accomplish here. They're doing an assessment of a school district to determine its fiscal health in order to give them a bond rating. And, you know, I was going through the questionnaires that they've asked me recently, and, you know, I just did a bond rating about a month ago. And through our discussions with S&P, I can tell you that they were looking at all three of these funds together. And their questions, where they used to be general fund and rainy day fund, now they're coming in the form of ed, ops, and rainy day, because they even realize the interaction between the three funds. So I would recommend that, yes, you can click them all individually, but really, to tell the true story, you need to look at all three together. That's how I've been presenting my information to my school board now, where in the past I may have just really given them a detail about the general fund, but now I tell them all three together. The other thing I would add on this particular indicator, and I know from the prior committee meetings it was kind of brought up, but again, this is good data, but if I'm an outsider, I really don't know what this is telling me. I mean, I know what it's telling me, but is this good? Is this bad? What is the recommended rule of thumb of what that fund balance is supposed to be? You know, is it, you know, we've heard, I always use the 10 to 12%. I know the state kind of has a 12% line. But from an outsider, unless we kind of note some of those, now not every indicator has a benchmark, but I think if we can somehow incorporate benchmarks or state averages into some of these, that might help give the viewer a better idea of what they're actually looking at. Someone might think, oh, they got 5% on hand. Well, no, when it should be 12, it's kind of low. And in this example that you're showing here, you know, if I was a taxpayer and I saw my school district had 49% cash reserves, I'd be a little upset about why you're not spending the money on those kids. So I think we might want to try to incorporate on some of the indicators some sort of benchmark or average to give the viewer an idea of what they're looking at.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I certainly hear that, and I have heard that several times. I will say to date, DUAB in particular has been hesitant to include those type of benchmarks. Part of that was from the standpoint of when we first started this process, it was a new process, and really without going and talking to school corporations, it was difficult to know where that right threshold would be. You know, just as we did go through and do assessments, you know, when we did the committee meetings the last time, I think generally there was a talk about kind of that 112. There was like 8%, you know, or you're saying 10 to 12%. You know, I would say in doing the assessments, certainly spoke with school corporations that had other situations, some higher, some lower, and all really had valid reasons for why they were where they were. And I think that's where DUAB has always been concerned, is without really understanding each individual situation, it's hard to say here's that threshold. And also recognizing that if we put a threshold out there, there's a certain bias towards saying, well, the state threshold is X, so that's what I should be at. But that may not always be the right number. You know, maybe if you're a smaller school corporation, it needs to be bigger, or if you're a bigger school corporation, it can be smaller. So trying to have kind of that sensitivity to it is why we haven't gone down that road in the past. You know, I would say as we think through as this continues to evolve, I would say that may be a direction we head. I don't know, with this being the first year that we have kind of the new education and operations, I don't know if I would feel comfortable, because actually that's kind of one of my questions is, does that change the way, has that change kind of impacted what that number should be, or what that number is at the local level, what they consider that right number to be? Especially knowing from kind of the operational funds perspective, that I would imagine that spending's not as steady necessarily. It probably fluctuates a little bit more with capital projects. So how do you really sort out what that right number should be locally?
Yeah, I would agree that for my education fund, I am definitely more comfortable having a lower cash balance because I'm, for the most part, getting a steady stream of income in the middle of the month. Thank you, Melissa. And most of my expenditures are payroll and benefits. 90+% are, and those are consistent every month. So I don't have too much of the unknowns coming out of my education fund that I need the cash balance in there to be prepared for. On the flip side, in my ops fund, you never know what's going to happen with maintenance or upkeep of a building, and that's where I need to have a higher cash balance to be ready for those emergency situations. I don't have many emergency situations in education fund. So I agree with what you're saying. There may not be a one-stop shop for that. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, obviously, like you were saying, ultimately, each school corporation ends up going through that process of kind of presenting this information, and maybe that this is more of a situation where you are tying it to the local, the local management policies to say, here's what our policy is, here's where, this indicator is in terms of our local policy. I don't know. And again, I understand that people want the state to come out and say, here's where that number, here's a good range for that number. And maybe at some point we get there. I think with this first change, with this current change, I doubt we can get there this year. I think we'll have to go through a process of really talking. And now, obviously, 2020 has thrown a whole nother curveball into everybody's finances. So it may take a little while before we settle down and figure out what the finances are supposed to look like. So, all right. Any other thoughts on this?
I have a thought. I think there is a comparability issue, like Rob was saying. Maybe we shouldn't focus on where they should be at, but maybe have like a percentile measure, like just comparing against the other schools. You could maybe hover over the indicator and they could say this is, 13th, not best. I know the underlying story is always different, so that's not, they're like maybe best in this indicator and less in others, but just for comparability, maybe add something else.
Okay. Yeah, certainly something we can think through how to do that. All right. Next, we have tuition support per ADM as compared to general fund expenditures per ADM. Obviously, this was pretty specific to the old structure. I do think now this particular graph that I pulled probably doesn't show much in the way of saying, oh, maybe there's a red flag here, but particularly in situations where you have your expenditures per ADM are on an ongoing basis are trending higher than your tuition support per ADM, that is something that we would look at and try to say, okay, what's going on there? How are you filling that gap? Is that sustainable? So on this one, I think it would, I guess, obviously, first we have to deal with the fact that this one, it looks at general fund expenditures per ADM and kind of talk through, does it make sense to switch that to education fund, or is that really not a comparison that would work in this case?
Traditionally, tuition support is the main revenue in the education fund. So at a minimum, I do think you have to switch it to education fund expenditures per ADM. But then I'm also thinking of what Rob is saying about the transfers to and from the education and ops fund. But for just an individual component looking at tuition support, I think that it should reflect education fund expenditures only, maybe because that is where the revenue is deposited and that is showing, you know, the instructional expenditures, and that is the indicator as you opened with, are they spending more than they're actually getting in revenue now through that per ADM amount? So I do think you have to switch it up.
Okay. All right. Now, with the, I guess the question I would have is, with the transfers, will this data start to look different? So if there's a certain portion of that's being, of the tuition support that's being transferred over to the operations fund, will we start to see kind of a differentiation there? Maybe I don't know, I'll have to play that out in my head a little bit.
That we're going to have to consider, because for discussion purposes, let's say ADM and funding is consistent, but starting in 2019, you know, 15%, 10 to 15% of those expenditures are being done somewhere else. Mm-hmm. So either it's not going to be consistent by 10, 15%, or we would need to include the transfers in it. Right. But I am not sure how I feel about the transfers being included, because those aren't really being expended from that fund. They're really the expenditures of the operations fund. So it is a little gray there. I think if we don't include the transfers, then you're going to see this widened gap that's going to make it look as if we have so much revenue coming in and the education fund expenditures themselves are much less. And so that's not really telling the true story either. So it's a little tricky.
Yeah, and I guess that's what I was thinking is this chart over time, you're going to start to get into a situation where schools will field that question more and more of, you're receiving X amount per student, but you're only spending this much, and what's happening. And while certainly those who are involved in the school finance situation understand the transfers, from a general public perspective, that's not going to be as obvious as to what that difference is. It's just going to look kind of awkward, I think, from a school corporation perspective. Okay. Well, and then I guess I have to think through, with those transfers, need to think through, does that actually impact the usefulness of this particular indicator? I think situations where we've had in the past where general fund expenditures are greater than the tuition support, and like I said, that was something that certainly would catch our attention, and we would want to dig in on that further. But if we're going to end up in a situation where more often than not we're seeing tuition support is greater than your ed fund per ADM expenditures, how do we, from a DUEP perspective, how do we identify, well, this one might have a concern associated with it? Or does it just kind of get buried in that difference? All right, I'll have to think through that one a little bit more too.
Well, I guess it goes back to, and this goes to the committee's first formation, is who is all this information for? Yes, we want to share with our public. They have a right to know how we're operating. But if it's mainly going to be used by DUAB to get ahead and help out those struggling school districts, then as long as you understand it, then maybe it's not as important.
Sure. Yeah, I would say that question has gotten muddier in the last 2 years. I think when we did this committee originally, I do think ultimately that was kind of my take, was these indicators really are for the purposes of DUAB being able to say, here's who we should go do an assessment on. Since that time, though, I know the statute has changed. I know school corporations are required to do kind of that annual report to their board on it. So I do think that there is more emphasis on the public side of it now, public and school board perspective, than what we had when we originally formed this committee. So I think from a potential impact perspective, obviously the DUAB side is probably still the heavier side, but also want to be fair and not create situations where we, paint school corporations into a bad corner just simply because of the way the indicators are shown. So, all right. Let's go to the next one. This is revenue by type. Again, this is a situation where we have the old fund structures kind of up there as different options, and I think whatever fund changes we would make, we'd obviously want to be consistent across all of these, so we can better show that. This one, something to be aware of is when we do these indicators, we don't include the transfers or anything. We don't include those sections of the Form 9 that really capture the transfers. So that's something that we need to kind of think through, and whether it's on this particular one or some other indicator, do we need to show the transfer amounts somewhere, would be just kind of a general question. This particular indicator, kind of thinking through the way that we used it, I would say this was often used in conjunction with the annual deficit and surplus to say, okay, we are seeing a spike here in revenues in this particular year, what happened? And so kind of those, coming back to those statements of, well, when you did a bond issue, you would see that dump in your annual deficit surplus indicator. Oftentimes then you could come to this indicator to kind of see that and understand that's where that was coming from. Or perhaps there was a large increase in a special federal grant or something like that you could see here. So, but open to any ideas or suggestions on this indicator? All right. Okay. All right, we'll keep moving on. Operating referendum revenue as percent of total revenue. So again, we do have the option here to select which funds are being included in that comparison. I would say most often the default has been to really look more at total revenue to try to say what sort of reliance the school corporation has on their operating referendum revenue. But again, I'm not sure if the change in accounting structure impacts how we should be looking at that, and should we isolate that more and isolate that more down to just education operations and rainy day or something along those lines. And open to any thoughts or suggestions. All right. Well, now we're going to jump to the last one. The last one here was general fund salaries and benefits as percent of general fund expenditures. Again, I think a lot of the conversation that we had earlier on general fund expenditures for ADM probably applies here with kind of changing to education fund. But again, the question, I would pose the question of how valuable does this indicator, how valuable is this indicator given the transfers? I think historically, this indicator kind of would set off red flags from one of two perspectives. One, that the school corporation's salaries and benefits were such a high percentage of their general fund that they really had very little flexibility for anything else. Or the opposite side would be a situation where the salaries and benefits were such a low percentage of their overall expenditures that more likely than not, the school corporation was running other expenses in their general fund that would have otherwise been funded in some of their other operational funds. That's kind of the two extremes that would typically cause DUAB to look at this particular indicator and try to dig in to identify what was going on. But with the transfers between the different funds, is this still valuable? Okay. Well, so again, these are some things we can keep thinking through and kind of have the questions out there, and we can come back and talk about these further as we've had the opportunity to dig in on them. Just a few other things here, and then after this we'll jump into public comment. So anything else? I know the last time that this committee kind of worked through this process, we were interested in not having so many indicators that it was overwhelming. You know, but are there other items that we are missing that should be accounted for here? You know, with the change in the accounting structure, are there new things that school corporations are looking at in assessing fiscal health that we haven't captured?
Personally, I like the number. I think 8 or 9 indicators is good. I like what the committee rolled out before. I think if you start adding too many more, you just get lost in too much data. And the more, I want to say, the more you put out there, the more likely there's going to be an indicator that's giving a false negative, as you indicated before. So I think having them stick with the same core or swapping one out or something, I think was what I recommend. Yeah.
Okay, great. All right. Any other thoughts from the committee?
I agree with Rob's comments. I don't think I would want to expand the number of indicators, but in my head, there's other things that are not on the indicator list that may reflect some of the problems going on with the school district. It could be the tenure of staff. Are they having a lot of turnover, you know, or people retiring, et cetera? So there's so many little nuances that are associated with each school that kind of fill in the missing pieces of what you might see through this picture. So I can't see, I'm like Rob, after you look at so many graphs and things like that, you're kind of overwhelmed with data, and it's like, what are the key ones we want them to look at? And then as you visit or talk to schools, then that's when you get the rest of the info that you need.
Yeah, and that is exactly what would happen, and that was part of the assessment process specifically was, you know, has there been key turnover? What has your staffing trends been? Those were all questions that were asked during the assessment process to kind of better understand the story, each school corporation's story. So, okay. All right, we're going to go ahead and move into public comment then. So just real quick here, for folks who are here, I'm going to give you kind of how to let us know that you want to comment. So the first kind of the first example here on the left, I guess, I don't know, where it says participants, and then you have attendee. Down here, you should see a little hand. That is your opportunity to raise your hand to say that you would like to speak. The other screenshot here is from the WebEx application. So if you are on your mobile device, You actually first have to go up at the top. There is a little person up there with some lines next to them. You have to click on that to get to the participants panel, and then you can click on raise hand to let me know that you are interested in speaking. What will happen is you can go ahead and select raise hand, and then in the order that we get those notifications, I will call your name and I will unmute your microphone. You can go ahead and give your comments, and then at the end of your comments, I will remute your microphone and move on to the next individual. Comments can also be emailed to DUAB, or sorry, it should be to the Indicators Committee. I reuse these slides. But to this committee at indicators@duab.in.gov. Anything that is sent in there, I will make sure it gets back out to the full committee. You also can leave a voicemail at this phone number here, 317-234-2273. Any comments that are left there will have transcribed and, again, provided back to the committee. Let's see. I think, yeah. So those are all of my notes on kind of how this will work. So if you are here and you would like to go ahead and provide comment, I would just go ahead and ask that you hit one of those raise hand buttons at this point in time. And it will let me know that you are interested in speaking. All right. Any takers? Okay. All right. Last call for any public comments. Okay. I am not seeing anyone pop up as raising their hand. So we will just go ahead and move on from that. But again, just before I do that, I do just want to reiterate for anyone on the call, or even if you're watching this recording after the fact, if you do have comments that you want to share with us, please email or voicemail. That will be very helpful for us as we work to really fine-tune these indicators and figure out what the final version of these indicators will be. So with that, I think next I would just ask if there is any new business from any of the committee members. Anything else that we have not touched on that you wanted to talk through? Okay. Well, seeing none, then first I want to let everybody know that we do have another meeting that is scheduled. It will be for October 28th at 2 p.m. Eastern. So we will come back again here on WebEx and kind of think through a lot of the questions that we have pending from this particular meeting and kind of sort out where we want to head. So again, October 28th at 2 p.m. And we will, the official information and the web links and things will be posted up to the DUAB webpage on Monday. But I probably will send out via the listserv, I'll send out the information earlier by the end of this week, so you have that information. Then just one final note before we do adjourn. At the end of this, when you log off, a survey is going to pop up. That is actually for WebEx. It does not come to this committee. So I would just ask that if you do have any feedback specific for the committee, please email us at indicators@duab.in.gov. If you do leave any feedback up in that survey, we will not receive that. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and adjourn the meeting. So thank you, everybody, for attending. I greatly appreciate it, and see you all next week.
Thanks.